Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another of these conversations. Today, it's our extreme pleasure to welcome Professor Andy Martin to the conversation with Jessica and I. So Professor Andy Martin is a professor in sport and physical education at Massey University in New Zealand. And just last year, Andy was named a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy in recognition of his teaching, scholarship, and leadership, particularly around work integrated learning. This isn't the first award that Andy's received. He's also received New Zealand's National Tertiary Teaching Award for Sustained Excellence. So that's through Ako Aotearoa. And he's also been recognized with a number of university awards over the years. In 2007 from the Vice Chancellor's Excellence Award for Sustained Commitment to Teaching Excellence, and also in 2015 for being an outstanding role model committed to teaching excellence. So it's really a great pleasure to have you here, Andy. We can't wait for the conversation to start.
Great, thanks, Pat, for the introduction, and great to reconnect with you once again.
Absolutely. So Andy, we'll just start with a pretty open-ended question here. Can you tell us your story? How did you get to where you are now as a university professor, receiving these awards for excellence and being an educational leader in this field?
I guess my whole career has been around education. And if I think back about when I started in education, it really was as a coach of an 11-year-old football team. My father coached me as a young kid at primary school. And once I'd sort of left the primary school team, he sort of stopped coaching and that team, and I actually started coaching the team that he was coaching. So I've been coaching for a long time without giving my age away. So that's 40 plus years coaching, and I guess that's continued. I went through university, did maths because I was good at maths, and ended up teaching maths at a private school or public school in the UK, a school called Millfield School. Which was also a sports school. So I guess teaching and sport have been linked with me all the way through as a coach. And I guess I see myself probably more as a coach than as a teacher. And I guess, well, maybe we'll talk about the difference between a coach and a teacher later. But and again, moving on as now, I guess, an educator in a tertiary institution, I still see myself more as a coach than a lecturer, particularly when I see other lecturers lecture, and I'm definitely not a lecturer. There's an adage of, lecturing's about passing information from one person to the other without it going through the brains of either, and hopefully I'm not that. So yeah, I definitely see myself more as a coach. And whether that's at a school setting, whether that's at with my kids, my own kids who are now bigger kids, but also now as an educator for the last 20 plus years at a university, it's very much about coaching, which is more than just subject specific stuff. It's, I guess, looking at trying to educate the whole person, and we have a saying in New Zealand, better people make better All Blacks. And I think that adage goes through. And I guess as an educator in a tertiary environment, yes, I teach sport management or sport coaching, or I used to teach maths. And yet it'd be great if they're all good at what they do in that area. But I'm actually more interested that they actually become better people when they leave university. And, that 3-year period at university is not just about subject specific knowledge. It's about becoming a better person and a better citizen going forward. So yeah, that's probably in a nutshell my background from sort of coaching sport, teaching at a school, and now ending up teaching sport, but also work integrated learning, which is that next phase of actually the theory that you've learned at university, putting into the practice. So yeah, definitely a practice-based educator, and you and I both come from that sort of experiential educator background. Yeah.
Andy, I'm really curious about the sort of distinction between coaching and teaching. And I think you've articulated it really beautifully through the lens of a show that I've just recently watched called Ted Lasso. I don't know if you've seen Ted Lasso. It is about American football coach from sort of the Midwest who is brought in to teach or to coach a Premier League team. And he doesn't know anything about English soccer. He knows a lot about American football. And he is brought in and he puts a sign in the locker room that says believe. And it's unclear over the 2 seasons whether that is believe in winning, believe in yourself, believe in belief. But there's this entire episode where they have their hopes up, and in the region that he's coaching, they have a sort of saying in the community that says, "It's the hope that kills," and that's very British. All right, like don't get your hopes up, don't be too effusive. And he comes in with this sort of winsome, hopeful American perspective. And he said, you know, it's not the hope that kills, it's the hope that gets you up and it gets you moving. And I want my players to have hope and to have belief and to not focus on, you know, past losses, to imagine themselves as goldfish, right? So that their memories of past failures are erased and that they're always future facing. And it strikes me that you share some pretty fundamental principles of hope, of belief, of coaching a whole person, and of not being about the content, although the content is really important, but to be about the ways in which you can understand future facing performance based on the individual capacities. I wonder maybe if you could just speak to any of those things that resonate for you in your own experience.
Yeah, I think they certainly do. And I think back to when I was a high school teacher teaching maths. Now, I don't know what you were like at maths at school. Maybe you thought it was great like I did. But when I went into a maths class, like I was pretty excited about maths. You know, when I was at school, I did maths and I did more maths and I did even further maths and I did as many maths, you know, more maths and additional maths that I could do. But when I started teaching, it was pretty clear that whilst I might stand up at the front of the class and go, hey, maths is, you know, maths rocks, this is exciting, like I wasn't getting the same faces back. So I kind of realized really early on that I actually had to do something a little bit different than just teaching maths. You know, that wasn't going to work. That wasn't really going to excite and connect these kids. So I had to do other things. And I guess going forward to being a tertiary educator, I know you have the same saying over in Canada, but we have a saying here of C's get degrees. Now, for me, I'm a sport person, you know, and the thought of, you know, competing to try and get fourth didn't seem to, you know, work with me. And I remember back to one of my first classes as a maths teacher, and they were called the borderline class. We had grading. I know nowadays grading maybe have gone out. I'm not sure it has gone out in Canada or not, but you know, classes were graded. So, you know, you had class 1, which was the bright kids, you know, the maths geeks. And then you went all the way down to class 10, who were probably going to fail. And I ended up with the borderline class. So they're the ones that were predicted to get C's or D's. You know, and so I was kind of in the middle. And all these kids knew that they were the borderline class, you know, and I was like, this ain't going to work, because, you know, if you go, you know, fourth sucks, and if you're going for the gold medal, you know, fourth sucks. And I'm like, why would we want to get a D? You know, why are we aiming for a D? So, or a C, you know, why are we aiming for a C if it's C, D? You know, because if you don't get a C, you get a D. It's a bit like going for the bronze medal and you get fourth. That sucks. You don't go for bronze, you go for gold. So I actually said to this class, hey guys, I know you think you're the borderline class, but hey, we're going for B's and A's. And they looked at me like, you're a dummy. You know, like, we don't get B's and A's. But that was my whole pretext of the class. Like, we're going to get B's and A's in this class. And through that, just changing that persona for them, that they weren't the borderline class anymore, we're going for B's and A's. And I do exactly the same now in my tertiary class. So especially when they come into the workplace, work integrated learning, you know, they're going to do internships. I'm like, how many of you are, you know, how many of you winged it to get through to third year with C's? And, you know, I said, you don't have to put your hand up, but I'm like, it's okay. But this class isn't, we're not getting C's in this class. We're getting B's and A's. So it's changing that expectation. And I guess I talk about it as great expectations, and setting great expectations. And I guess that's one of the things that I've always done, whether I'm a coach or whether I'm a teacher or whether I'm a lecturer, is set great expectations. You know, and I don't apologize when I coach my sports teams and go, hey, we're out here to win. And that's not very PC these days. You know, like, we're supposed to have fun and yeah. But I'm like, hey, it's much more fun to win. And okay, we don't win all the time. And I remember about 10 years ago, I coached a girls team for the first time. Never coached a girls team before. And this was a high school girls team, football team, soccer in the States. And they'd managed to qualify for the national tournament. So it was a big deal for the school. And they kind of asked me to be the coach because they thought I was a good coach, or somebody must have told them, hey, Andy's a good coach. And they're going to nationals. And at the start, they were like, you know, like, it was just a big deal to be at nationals. So there was no performance whatsoever. And so then I started talking to them about, so, you know, what are we going to do at nationals? And they're like, well, I don't know, we're just going to play. I'm like, no, we're not just going to nationals to play. What's the deal? And so we changed it around as like, well, actually, we had this group stage, first of all. And then if you won the group stage, you got to the top 8. So I said to them, and they're like, they'd never even been to nationals before, let alone get to the top 8. So I'm like, we're a top 8 team. We're going top 8. And they all looked at me like, you're a dummy. Like, we've only just qualified, you know, we're not going to get there. But it was changing the expectation that we're a top 8 team. Now, in the end, we finished 10th. So that's okay. But it was about changing that expectation of where they could do. And I see that with my kids that come into university class and they've managed to wing it through, and suddenly they're in my class. And then I'm like, no, this is B's and A class. And I'm like, ooh. But once we have that expectation, then they rise to that expectation rather than rise to the bottom level. So, yeah, I guess that's cool. And I guess the same for my kids, you know, like my own kids, I have the, you know, they don't have to win all the time, but we have that expectation, you know, that's the goal. We're not just there to have fun. I mean, we are there to have fun, but it's much more fun to win. So I am competitive and I don't apologize for that.
I do think you should watch Ted Lasso because it is,
okay. I'll write it down.
He doesn't understand ties. Like, as an American, he does not understand what a tie is. And right. So, and, you know, Pat and I as Canadians sort of watch, I love it because it's between these two cultures. Neither one of them is ours. And you can sort of see the different kinds of ideologies of belief, of hope, of where you meet the individual, where you have them in context and how you transform together. So I do, I recommend it because it's a surprise. It was a surprise hit for me. I was sort of getting ready to dislike it because I was like, I don't know about bringing somebody in who doesn't know anything about the game is problematic. But what he was framing for me or making visible or surfacing was the elegance of coaching, not the content of it. And I think you've just really nicely.
I think you've made a really good point there. It's the wider thing that's more important. And I remember back when I was at school and in my final year at high school, and just remember I was good at maths. And I had a maths teacher. They must have, for whatever reason, not had any maths teachers that year to teach the top class. Now, my maths teacher was an art teacher, and she came in and she said, I'm an art teacher. I don't know much about maths. And I'm like freaking out because I'm like, you know, I love maths. And like, she was the best teacher ever because she would write stuff on the board that was wrong. But me being good at maths, I was like, I had to follow her so closely the whole time because I had to spot the mistake. She was an awesome teacher. But exactly as you said, she was a teacher. She was an educator. The subject didn't matter. The fact that she knew nothing about maths doesn't matter. And I guess good educators are good educators. Doesn't matter about the subject. It's the educator part. They can make it fun. They can make it enjoyable. You can set those great expectations. Whether they know anything about the subject is not the important part. It's part of the process. So no, I think you've made a really good point there.
And I think there's also the point too, like it's about the culture that's built, right? And so, Andy, another piece of your bio that I neglected at the front end was that the fact that you're a co-author of these 2 books on the All Blacks and the Silver Ferns and their culture of winning, right? A will to win and Legends in Black. And these are globally high profile winning organizations, and there's a culture there. So I'm wondering if you have any lessons to tease out of there that maybe relate to failure or growth from failure, or, you know, if you're always in a winning culture with these expectations, what does it look like to fail?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that they're 2 slightly different teams there. So the All Blacks have a quite remarkable winning record over 100 years, you know, probably the highest winning percentage of any team globally. So why do they win all the time? That's what we were kind of interested about. And part of that is that they have an expectation that they're going to win. Now they do lose, but don't play the All Blacks the week after they've lost, because they don't lose 2 times in a row very often. So what they do have is a very strong learning culture. And I think I mentioned really early on that sort of saying about better people make better All Blacks. And that is a saying that's sort of come about really in the last 15 years. And the changes in cultures, and you may not know the names of the coaches, and that's not important, but they realized that they actually had to change as coaches. They'd come from Graham Henry, who was the coach for the All Blacks when they won in 2011, the World Cup. He'd come from a teacher background. He was a headmaster, and that's how he coached. He was very autocratic, Mr. Headmaster. But in terms of growing the team, when you're out on the pitch, the players make the decisions, not the coaches. So unlike basketball and American football, where often it's the coach on the side that's telling what the play is. Whereas in rugby, you're on the pitch and you have to make the decisions, and in football, you have to make the decisions. And they realised as a coaching team, if they didn't change, the All Blacks weren't going to evolve, and they needed to make the players make more decisions. So I think one of the key things there is that it's a learning culture. In other words, if you're the #1 team in the world, everybody else is going to copy you because you're the best. Now, once the other teams copy you, that means you're not the best anymore because they're just as good. So you have to stay ahead. So you have to keep changing. But your fundamental beliefs, and we looked at the culture of the All Blacks, so their beliefs and values are around winning, around mateship. So they have some very strong values. They have, I don't know whether you can see, I'll just move. So I got a nice t-shirt on here, which has got this little silver fern, which is a really big, important emblem in New Zealand. But that symbol is really important. I haven't got a black jersey, but the white jersey is really important to them. That black jersey, the silver fern, and I guess for most national teams, that would be the same. So that sort of culture of those symbols, the haka that they do before, All Blacks games, they're the visual symbols that you and I can see. But below the surface, that sort of iceberg, they have these really strong values and core assumptions that are within that team. And one of those is definitely this learning culture that we have to get better. And interestingly enough, with the Silver Ferns, which is New Zealand's netball team, I know netball is not necessarily a huge game in Canada, although I'm not sure why not, because it's a Commonwealth country, and Australia are normally the best team in the world. So unlike rugby, New Zealand isn't the best team in the world. Australia is and has been, basically it's Australia or New Zealand have either won the World Championships in netball forever. But New Zealand don't win that often, maybe once in every 4 times. And actually looking back, it was kind of like once every 16 years. So that's a long time to wait for a World Championship. So we kind of looked back to see why they win sometimes and why they don't win all the time. So it was slightly different research. And again, what came out was when they did win, they had a coach that was strong, was autocratic, but was also empowering and let the players make the decisions. So they still had that strong culture. And again, within the Silver Ferns in New Zealand, and we have quite a multicultural society in New Zealand, as well as our sort of Indigenous culture. We've got the Pacific Island culture as well, and we've got other countries coming to join. So, for example, within the New Zealand team for a while, they had some South African players that had sort of come and become New Zealanders. So they had to meld that culture together. So I guess the key there was, again, learning when they won, how they won. So now that hopefully will help the Silver Ferns going forward. And currently the Silver Ferns are the world champions. So it was kind of like, oh, we actually knew they would be world champions before they became that, because they had all the elements of what we saw was going to be a winning culture. So I think, and again, going back to your comment at the beginning about Ted Lasso, was it's about that culture, and the coach sets the culture. And I think that's, again, as an educator, and for me being a tertiary educator, we're the ones that set the culture within our classroom. And that culture becomes really important. So, this is the beginning of our semester over here in New Zealand, so beginning of our academic year. I know it's not quite for you, but I've just done that with my first class, asked them about them. So I obviously told them about me. This is Andy Martin, I'm a teacher, educator, blah, blah, blah. But I've asked all of the students about them, about their culture, their experiences, their sporting backgrounds, about what they bring to the class, because it's not just about me. The learning is actually going to come from everybody in the class. So again, that team culture, and I think, I've, through doing that research with the All Blacks and the Silver Ferns, that culture is really, critical to the success of a team. So it's not just the coach. The coach doesn't form the culture. The team forms the culture. So when Ted Lasso, whilst clearly is a good coach, it's actually the team that forms the culture. Now, obviously, the coach has an impact on helping that culture along.
Oh, I love this. And it reminds me of a podcast that I was listening to recently that was interviewing Pippa Grange, who wrote a book. She's a sports psychologist, and she wrote a book called Fearless: How to Win at Life Without Losing Yourself. And she was brought in to work with the English national team for the Football Association, so soccer in the UK, but she has also worked with Australian and I think New Zealand sports teams. And she's an expert on fear, anxiety, and perfectionism. And she's just resonated entirely with what you've talked about with the learning culture, which is how to not be without fear. So fearless they're two words, right? So you're still allowed to be afraid. You're still allowed to feel discomfort, but you fear it less, or you don't allow that anxiety and perfectionism to take over. And she says it happens when you make deeper connections with one another. So it's really tied to that culture that the players are building, that the coach is facilitating, and value signaling. So my question is, and I think that we've got some sphere of control and influence within our classrooms. And so we can set culture there. And sometimes we can set it in our department and or division. How do we do it at an institutional wide level? How do we do it with the systems? Because I think I'm going to just use I here. I can create values and systems and how things circulate within my own classrooms. But I sometimes wail in despair at my own university context, which is not anchoring those values in practice. And in fact, I think COVID has exposed a number of elements of toxic culture. How do we take what we tell our students to do, and how do we do it ourselves with our colleagues and our administrative leaders?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good issue, and COVID has highlighted that, because one of the things that it's created is this online culture, which we're doing now because we're talking online, and it makes people hide, and it maybe also makes our managers hide, because it's easier to stand behind a Zoom screen rather than actually talk to somebody. And we have a culture now with our younger people who are, texting. So, what we're doing now, which is actually talking to each other, is kind of almost old school these days. And, one of the biggest struggles I have, one of the biggest challenges I give to my students when they go into the workplace, when I'm doing work integrated learning or cooperative education, as it's called in Canada, is pick up the phone. Just go and talk to somebody. So at the moment when my students are arranging their workplaces, they tell me, oh, I've sent an email, I've sent a text. And I'm like, yeah, when did you do that? I'm like, and they're like, oh, maybe a week ago. I'm like, well, what happens if you don't get a response? Well, I'll send another text. I'm like, chances are you won't get a response again. How about pick up the phone? So I think old school talking, and that's definitely me. And your point around how do we deal with our bosses, etc., or the wider thing, is for me around coaching. And the word coaching again, and I, being an older person, I went on a leadership course a while back, and it was run by an organizational psychologist. And the same comment that you just made, and he said, Andy, you get frustrated by these difficult sort of people, don't you? And I'm like, yeah, I get real frustrated. It's really annoying. And we actually talked about the coaching thing too, because I used to struggle with coaching the real talented athlete, your Ronaldo or something like that. And how do you coach them? Because they're not team players. They're so good, but they don't play as a team. And so it was about, and again, this being in the workplace, when you get frustrated or you're dealing with a difficult person, it might be a difficult staff member. I just used to get frustrated. And he's like, well, you're a coach. Why don't you coach them? And he actually flipped this around in terms of saying, this is a difficult situation or a difficult person or a challenging person. He just said, hey, you're a coach. This is a problem solving. This is a fascinating person. This is a really good challenge. So with my good player, it wasn't him that did this. This was something else. But it was, hey, with the good player, it's not how do I make you better. It's actually how do we make the team look good. And this was something coming back to Michael Jordan, who you would know from basketball. Now, he played obviously for the Bulls, and the Bulls didn't win for a long time. And then they got a no-name coach who actually is not a no-name coach anymore because they won lots of championships. But how do you be a no-name coach coming in? You got Michael Jordan in the team. And Michael Jordan was trying so hard to make the Bulls better. And he'd score 40 points or 50 points or, and then they'd be 10 points down and Michael would try. But the other teams, it was easy. They triple teamed him and, game was over. And then, so the no-name coach came along and said, hey, Michael, I just want you to make the team look good. So instead of trying to beat 3 players, how about beat 2, lay it off, make the other guy look good, and they can get 2 points. So I want you to score 30, but I want the rest of the team to score 10 each. And obviously the rest of the story's there. And so I started doing this with my really talented players, and it was about coaching them, in the same. And I remember one of my really talented footballers, hey, Ryan, you got to make the team look good. And after he'd lay the ball off, he'd run back to the halfway line, give me a little smile. We both knew he'd made the team look good. He still did the silky skills. He'd still beat 2 players. Sometimes he'd try and do too much, but he'd lay it off, make the other guy look good. Got it. And then coming back to your question, which was about the organizational, how do we make our bosses look good? Well, we coach them. So, and universities are a hierarchical type of organization. So like you say, we're low down in the pecking order, but hey, we can coach them. So my boss may be listening to this, but I coach him. You know, and I go, you know, things like, hey, I suggest you might do that, you know, might do that. So we're not necessarily, so it's the same way. And, you know, I suggest we might have more team meetings. Now, it doesn't always work, and you might still get frustrated, but at least you're trying. At least you have, rather than just kind of giving up and going, this is a shambles, and you know, this isn't a culture I really enjoy. You can work with them, and with the work integrated learning. So I chair the work integrated learning committee for our university, and I have a great team. I'm not, you know, whilst I'm good at work integrated learning, I can't do it on my own. But it's about coaching up. So one of the key things that the organization psychologist told me was, keep telling them what you're doing. So we have regular feedback to the big bosses, our senior leadership team at the university, about what we're doing. They don't ask for it. We just give it every month or every couple of months. We give them a feedback saying, this is what we're doing. And with my boss, every month I tell him what I'm doing, because he never asks, but I'm just going to tell him. So hopefully he realizes I am doing something, and hopefully from the university, they realize that we're doing stuff. But what happens is then they start coming back going, oh, well done, that was really good. Maybe so now we have, you know, more of that in our strategy for the university, etc. And so you start getting some wins.
It starts to become naturalized, right? Like it's no longer an outlier. It's a core piece, because they have been told about it so many times. The next time they're asked to write any sentences, it's in there.
Absolutely. So we now have a statement within our university about working in our strategy about work integrated learning. And I often joke with my team that we're running the university. It's just the university doesn't know that that's what's happening. So, you know, Jess, you can still run your university. They may not realize you're running the university, but at least you feel good that you're doing your bit, rather than just going, oh, this is so frustrating, I've had enough of it. And I think, you know, that communication and regular communication is really important, especially now when we've all gone online and it's really easy to hide. Like my boss is in Auckland, which is, you know, a 6-hour drive from here. So I never see my boss. I haven't seen him for 2 years. And with the online and the lockdowns and all that sort of stuff, it has made people sort of become more insular. But it's also made our bosses more insular, because it's easy for them just to send out a Zoom message or an email. You know, it's management by email. It's not management by talking. So, you know, I think it's much easier. You and I can see facial expressions now, but, you know, we can see laughter, we can see smiling. But when you just get an email, then we might just get a grumpy email. But that might not be the intent of the email, but we have that, you know, we tend to form that. So it's much easier. So that's why we now, you know, try with my group and me as a coach. So I coach up. So I talk about coaching up. And I think that's been really good for me as an educator, because I do coach, but we tend to coach, you know, our team or our students or whatever, almost coach. I shouldn't say coaching down, that's not right. But in terms of that hierarchy, coaching up, I think, is a really useful skill. And as a good educator and a good coach, we have those skills to do that. And like I say, we don't get wins all the time, but as time goes on, hopefully you do. And you know, if you don't get any, then eventually maybe you leave or you retire. But I think you're right. That's how you can change the culture. And one of my bosses, so the dean we have a dean of enterprise, and I just rang him yesterday and said, well, maybe you should be the dean of will and enterprise, tongue in cheek. But actually now that's a thought that's there. And he's like, well, actually, that sounds good. And he loves the culture that we have. He loves being in our meetings. He loves coming to our meetings because they're smiley and they're happy and they're fun. And Will was a great space to be in because there's lots of positive outcomes. And that's not the sort of meetings he normally goes to. where we're worried about budgets and all that's the financial drama of universities. So I think it's about creating a culture where it's a winning culture. And we have, within our Massey environment, we have a winning world culture.
And what's really interesting there is just like, it's such a fine line between one and the other. Like I heard this said about a fantastic employee who I happen to know, where they're a nuclear bomb or they're a nuclear reactor, depending on how you manage or coach them, right? Don't coach them, let them go off in all wild directions. It's going to explode. It's going to make everybody look bad, up, down, and sideways. But harness that power, and it's just ticking over, like positive outcome over positive outcome over positive outcome. And I think that's probably the case with a number of the concepts here that we're talking about, right? It's not far from despair and failure and vulnerability to growth and hope and resilience, right? And so I'm wondering if you can speak to any of those on a more general sense, Andy.
No, I think you've hit it there, and I think I said right at the start, am I an exceptional educator? Well, the answer is, for some or for many, the answer is yes. But there are still students that don't like me, will make a complaint. There are staff that there are lots of staff that I inspire and think, Andy's a fantastic educator or supervisor for a PhD, but there are others that don't. So I don't, that's my challenge, is, you're not, and you've just talked about that fine line about going back and forward. My footballer, who was a great footballer, but actually as a team player wasn't. But once I got him playing as a part of the team, he was fantastic. So you gave an example there of a staff member who kind of doesn't fit the bill. But actually, if you can get him alongside you, he contributes really well. But if you let him go, he'll undermine everything you do. So I think that's, that again, that communication, and it comes down to coach. It does come down to coaching and creating that culture. I think within the world culture we have here at Massey, within our team, we've created that positive environment where people can go and do their own thing, but they're really contributing to the team. And that's what we wanted across the whole university, because there are so many different people doing different types of will. We're not telling them, hey, you've got to do it this way. But if we can actually kind of empower them to go, well, actually, we'll support you to do it the best you can, and then that'll help their practice. So yeah, I think you're dead right, and that balance that we have between being a good educator and a bad educator sometimes is almost a fine line. If I give bad grades to my students, potentially they don't think I'm a very good lecturer. But if actually I talk to them about, I had a student yesterday, literally, who I'd failed. So I failed his first assignment for his work integrated learning, bang. And then he was starting his second one, and he hadn't bothered to read the information or whatever, and he just started doing it. And he said, I've done all this work, what do you mean? But then I got an email from him last night saying, hey, Andy, thank you so much for talking this through with me. I realize you don't have to do that, but it's made a big difference. I will now go and do what you want me to do. I paraphrase what he said, but again, it would have been very easy for him to go, because he's only just met me as an educator, to go, Andy's a bad lecturer, he's failed me, I'm out. But hopefully we've managed to just talk to him through, and actually now, he could be an A student, and hopefully he will. So I guess, I talked earlier about those great expectations, but the other thing I think we are as educators is a catalyst for change. And you've just highlighted potentially it could be a negative change, but hopefully it's also a positive change. That's what we're looking for as an educator, so whether, as a parent, you can get it wrong lots of time, and they're like, Dad's the worst parent, I hate Dad, but hopefully the lesson that you've just taught, that he's, been sent to his room or whatever, hopefully, going, okay, well, the penny might drop. But on the other hand, he's like, Dad, you're awesome. So yeah, that's, as parents, we're often on that fine line too sometimes, aren't we, between gee, what an awesome parent you are, to, God, you're a horrible parent. So yeah, it's about being that catalyst for change. And sometimes the change isn't always, that we're advocating isn't always a positive, it's actually, you've got to do this better. It's not always about the A and the B. It's actually, how do we stop getting the C and the D? Because we might need to address that first.
Yeah, and sometimes you have control over it and sometimes you don't, right? And there's, sometimes there's byproduct. If you're back to the nuclear reactor versus the nuclear bomb, the byproduct is going to be toxic sludge, right? You just gotta get that in the chin and deal with it. But I think one of the ways to minimize the damage and maximize the transformation is something that you talked about a little bit with Michael Jordan and the way in which he was coached by Phil Jackson, and Phil Jackson coming in as a sort of no-name coach and coming in and doing things totally differently and changing the culture. And one of the things that he did was he gifted each teammate a book. And he gave them a book based on their personality and their inclination. He said, I want you to go, so he's Scottie Pippen, go read this book. Michael Jordan, go read this book, and he would send them out. And then he would do like indigenous practices and teachings and meditation, and got them into yoga and got them into thinking differently. And I just watched a special with Michael Jordan. I'm sure you watched it as well,
Yeah.
Where he was coaching, Phil Jackson was coaching for curiosity. And I would take that one step further and maybe tie it to some of the work that you do in work integrated learning, but also as an educational leader, which is coaching for curiosity and critical reflection, right? And those things are kind of tied. And I understand a design principle of work integrated learning, or at least experiential learning, is the necessity of critical reflection, right?
Absolutely.
Is to stop and to be metacognitive about where and how you're learning at various points. Could you talk a little bit about critical reflection, and maybe that's a way forward to change the culture of the university, is to build that in more explicitly, both in our classroom practice, but also in our promotion, tenure review, in performance assessment for our colleagues and even our senior administrative staff?
Yeah, no, there's about 10 questions there, but I think let's go back to the work integrated learning part. I mean, I think Pat and I come from outdoor backgrounds, that, experiential educator. And John Dewey, who I guess is our grandfather in terms of books and stuff on education and experience education, said, just having an experience doesn't mean you've learned anything. And again, that was the conversation with my student last night. He said, like, I've done 4 weeks of work. And I said, yeah, but what have you learned in 4 weeks? There's no reflection, there's no link to theory, which is, the key part of work integrated learning, that reflection on practice. And you've done 2 years of study, but if you haven't learned anything for 2 years, when you go in the workplace, you're not going to be any good. So, I talked to him about that reflection on his practice, what he'd learnt. We're looking for those learning outcomes. And I think you're right. Probably the biggest thing for me as an educator has been reflecting on when I go wrong. And I if I go back to being a teacher, I might just see if I can find there's a nice, where's my little quote? It was really, I can't find it there, but when I was a teacher, as a maths teacher, it was those kids that I couldn't engage with that I struggle with the most. But it was finding ways that I could engage with those. So the fact that I can engage with the good ones, that's cool. But as I said, as an educator, it's engaging with those that you can't. And for me, teaching's all about that engagement. And again, whether you've with your kids as your own kids, if you lose that engagement, if they're not engaging with you, you've kind of lost them. So it's trying to find that little trigger with each of those individuals that will engage them going forward. And I guess that's what I'm looking for with all my, so you're treating them all as individuals rather than this is the maths class or this is the work integrated learning class. It's finding those little triggers. I remember in one of my maths classes early on, student wasn't that great at maths, but she was good at cooking. So I was a staff, I was single at the time and living, so she was in a boarding house, so she couldn't take the cooking back. So she started bringing the cooking to class. Well, that was the engagement. And her maths just suddenly didn't become amazing, but maths classes were okay after that, because I was like, wow, this is amazing, like that cooking. And we'd share stuff in class and about the cooking. It was supposed to be a maths class and we're talking about cooking, but for her, there was an engagement there. So I think it's about that engagement. And again, you moving forward in terms of the culture of the organization, it's engaging staff. You've got to keep them engaged. And Pat mentioned the staff member that's going to go AWOL and do his own thing. Well, how do we engage them and go, well, actually, maybe these practices we don't like, but these practices we do like. So actually, you can, if you keep doing that, you carry on doing that, because that's amazing. You know, I want you to do more of that. And I think sometimes at university, we are trying to make people good at everything. And I think it's interesting too that you mentioned about, you know, performance reviews and that sort of thing, because often in a normal workplace, if you're doing a good job, your boss will reward you. But in academia, often you have to self-promote. And so what I've done with a number of staff is actually I've self-promoted them. So I'm not their boss, but I've gone, actually, you should be a professor, or you should be a senior lecturer, or you should, and actually I'll write your CV for you, or I'll write your promotion application. And I just did this the other day. So staff member who is just an amazing educator, but maybe because they haven't got the odd publication or whatever, they're not a professor. Well, they're going to retire without being a professor. That's not right. So I've written and gone, hey, bosses, you need to promote this guy before he retires. So I think there's more of that where we can support colleagues. Doesn't necessarily have to be a head of department doesn't necessarily want to promote colleagues because it costs him more in his budget. So how do we promote a culture of promoting each other? Because actually, if we're all good, then we all should get promoted, and that's much better.
And that's really combating the sort of all of those myths of like tall poppy syndrome or crabs in a bucket or whatnot. It's like saying, you know, I've reached this level in leadership, and now I'm not going to cut off all the tops. I'm going to encourage all the tops to grow as high as they want. And it's okay if everybody gets 100%, or like, it's great to celebrate. And that's such a sort of guerrilla concept within within higher ed.
I think one of the ways I've done this particularly is with my, let's say, postgraduate students, masters or PhD students. And very early on, I say to them, hey, you're the expert, not me. Like, I might be an expert in how to get a PhD or how to get a master's, because I've done quite a few of these before. But your particular topic, you're the expert, not me. And it's flipping them around. And I actually get my students, and I do a lot of stuff to doctoral students, first year doctoral students, and they're all like, oh my God, I'm on this journey of, you know, trying to become a doctor. And I get them to sit in class and I said, right, repeat after me. I am Dr. whatever it is, Mayer, Riddell, Martin. And they look at me like I've gone nuts. And I'm like, no, repeat after me. I am Dr. Martin. And like, do this a couple of times and nobody's responding. And eventually they kind of clicks and they all look at me and they're all saying it, I'm Dr. whatever it is. And I'm like, do you know why I'm saying that? Because you will be. And you actually have to think what it's like to be Dr. Riddell or Dr. Mayer or Dr. Martin, even though you're not now, because you will be. And if you don't think you will be, you probably won't. So put it on your desktop or whatever, I am Doctor. And it was the same when I became a professor. What does being a professor mean? You know, what does that mean? There's no particular job description for being a professor or for being a doctor or whatever, but what does being a professor mean? And again, it was a conversation I had with this organization psychologist, and he was like, well, what do you want to be in 10 years? And it was about being a highly respected professor. But what does that mean? You know, so you have to kind of embody that person. And again, as a doctoral student, you haven't got a clue what being a doctor is, but eventually you do know that you're a doctor, because you can tell your supervisor, actually, no, that's not right, because they're the expert. And, you know, I think one of the key things I've learned is from my students, like, I'm not the expert, they are. And that's why, you know, at the beginning of class, I go, you know, what's your background? Where have you from? What are your sporting experiences? I am the expert because I have a title, lecturer or professor, and I'm standing at the front of the class, but all my class bring something to the party where they have expertise. And I think, you know, it comes back to, you know, an organisation you and I know really well, Pat, you know, Outward Bound, and their motto around "there's more to you than you think." Around, you know, at the moment, they just think they're students. So I, you know, in class the other day, first class, I said, how many of you are students? And again, they look at me like, he's a dummy. So, you know, I'm like, put your hand up if you're a student. And they're like, okay. So they all put their hands up. Cool, well done. All right, so I said, how many of you are professionals? One student puts their hand up. So I'm like, okay. So I asked the question again. I said, so how many of you are professionals? 2 or 3 hands up. So the penny's starting to drop, because these are all work integrated learning students. They're all out there in the workplace. So then eventually I'm like, okay, guys, how many of you are professionals? So then they all put their hand up. Okay, you got it. So I said, now the challenge for you guys is, are you a student or are you a professional? Are you going to stay in your student persona, or are you going to be in your professional persona? And that's the same for us. We might be, you know, what does a professor mean? Now, there are some professors that are professors that clearly should be a professor, and there are some maybe that aren't professors. So, you know, it's that persona. The same with a PhD student. When's a PhD student, you know, a doctor? For me, when they can actually tell me I'm doctor, whatever they are, because then that, you know, they have that persona of being Dr. Martin or Dr. Adele or Dr. Mayo or whatever. So I think that's, you know, that's key. And again, you know, that's part of the setting expectations. Yeah.
And Andy, you know, it strikes me that you've just given us a really nuanced understanding of what you mean by a winning culture, because you've just talked about the academy as a winning culture that is not deficit focused, right? That if I'm a professor, it means you can't be a professor and you can't be a professor. It actually means that not only are we winning, we're also, now our responsibility is to help others win, because there are not a finite number of pieces of pie. There are infinite pieces of pie where everybody can share the winning without diminishing, without being in opposition to a loser, right? So you've taken that binary opposition, and I love that you declared earlier, I'm competitive, but you're not competitive at the expense of collaboration. You're competitive because of collaboration, because
Absolutely.
there's a winning culture that you can take a lot of people along with you as you do a values-based leadership model. And I love that. I think that's a really important nuance. And it's one where in some of our Canadian institutions anyway, we have, because of scarcity, because of cuts to funding, because of austerity measures, there is a culture that people have internalized, which is a deficit culture. There's not enough. There's never enough X or Y. And I think it's internalized to I'm never enough. And then it gets really tricky. And people do treat awards as, well, Pat just got one, so I'm not going to get one, or Andy just got promoted to full professor, so I'm not going to, which is actually false. Like, everybody can get all of the things, especially if they apply for them. But there's this sort of energy in some of our institutions that is pretty narrow and I think a false culture. Can you want to talk a little bit about how to rewire
I guess
those mindsets?
I've been at university quite some time, probably more than you two guys, but and I've seen quite a change in culture. So when I first came to university as a staff member, we had morning teas, we had team meetings. Teaching was really a focus. We often taught about, you know, our classes and what we had to do. Hey, that's our business. We are a business where, you know, we're supposed to be educators. And I'd come from that background, and I love the teaching part of my role. And then, and I know this has happened in Canada and the UK, the sort of publish or perish, and it may have been around for a long time in others. So we had this sort of ranking system around, you know, publishing. So if you published ABC, you were sort of like a, you know, an A ranked professor, and then you were B ranked, and then you were C ranked, and then you were what they called research inactive. In other words, you're the lowest of the low. So a real sort of grading of, but it became a very individual culture because you got recognized for your publications. Now, what that forgot was to get publications, you had a team of people supporting that. So when you're a PhD student, to get some publications, it's your supervisors that are helping. Once you've got a PhD, then often you maybe are managing projects and other people are getting all those publications. So the fact that I'm a professor actually has a small part of me in it and a huge part of everybody else in it. And I know that I wouldn't have become a professor because I've collaborated with lots of people along the way, either in a small way or a big way. And I think that has been one of the challenges within university systems of not recognizing teaching. And so often we have to self-promote our teaching, but the research outputs are a little bit more explicit because you've got a citation index or something like that, or you've got it's more tangible. So I can say I've got 100 publications or whatever, and I've got so many in a top. So it's more quantifiable. So the scientist, it's easier for scientists. So the system tends to be a form, but from an educator's point of view, it's hard to be tangible to say, you know, how do I say that I'm a better educator than you, or, you know, so it's hard to say that. And that's where the reflective process has been really good for me. It is more holistic around that. Why am I a good teacher? And going through that reflective process, and the HEA now has sort of, you know, associate fellows, senior fellows, principal fellows. So maybe there is a ranking system there as well. But you have to have demonstrated why you're an associate fellow or a fellow through reflective practice, and an evidence-based reflective practice. And I would argue, again, in terms of a research portfolio, it should be the same. It should be more of a holistic, not just because it favors clearly the scientists that have 15 authors on a paper, whereas in social science, it might be you on a paper. So how do you compare one with one? And, you know, science has citation indexes for Africa, but, you know, we don't in social science. So we're not comparing like with like. So maybe that more holistic. And I guess that's, you know, what we're arguing here all along is a more holistic approach to teaching. So looking at the individual. So I work with some amazing staff that don't necessarily have the same attributes as me. But does that mean that they shouldn't get promoted just as I do? Just because I might have a few more publications than them? I don't think so. But in a holistic way, they contribute just as much, or if not more, to the greater good. And again, that the educator example I talked about, you know, probably one of the leading educators in the world, but he's not a professor. Go figure. So yeah, I think it is looking at that more holistic way, and maybe that's part of that coaching up, Jess, that we need to coach up with our organisations to say, actually, there is more of a team approach here. And I guess I'm probably just as proud that I've helped other people become an associate professor or a professor than I am that I got it too. Yeah. And it's, you know, it's playing the academic game, I guess. But if I've played the game for others and helped coach them, then I'm a coach. So I guess that comes for me as well, whether I'm coaching my students or coaching colleagues. That's probably my what makes me more excited.
Sort of come full circle, Andy, right? Like it's sort of you know, you feel better at the lifting up of others, right? And you know, all boats floating together. It's, you know, if I sort of had one last question for you when we're talking about this holistic teaching and learning, what are the pieces of that sort of keep you keep you awake at night? What are the pieces that drive you nuts and continually drive you nuts? Or what are the pieces that get you up in the morning because you're like, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to be the catalyst for change and fix this. And maybe it's the same thing, both sides of the coin, right? But just wondering your thoughts there.
I think it encompasses all of what I've said. So the setting great expectations is one, that catalyst for change. But I think what we've just been talking there at the end is as educators, we're leading a legacy or leaving a legacy. So my contribution is a tiny amount compared to the graduates that have now gone out into the industry that in a small way I've impacted as a catalyst or set some great expectations, but they're now doing way better things than I've ever done. You know, like one of our students managed the Rugby World Cup here. They were the event director. You know, I've had graduates managing facilities at the Olympics. So me as an educator is a small part, but as educators, we lead a legacy or leave a legacy. And that, you know, as parents, you know, I remember my father saying early on when, you know, as a kid growing up, I was like, I want to make a millionaire. I want to be a millionaire. You know, I want to make lots of money, as many kids will do. And my dad said to me, he said, you know what, for me, being a success for me is I've got a great wife and I have 2 great kids. That's success. And I think as educators, you know, that sort of binary principle of, you know, if we educate 2 people, that's twice what we do, and then they educate 2 people, and that, you know, so we have that snowball. And as educators, especially as we've been here for a long time, you know, I've impacted a lot of people, you know, so the sport management industry in New Zealand has flourished. Now I, as that little pebble in the pond, have started to, those ripples have gone much further than me. So my impact myself is really small, but the impact of my graduates is way bigger. So I think that would be my, if I was going to summarize 3 things, it would be the setting those great expectations, being a catalyst for change, and leading or leaving a legacy. And all of us as educators do that, hopefully in a positive way.
Andy, I just want to pick up on an essay I think you might enjoy reading about John Dewey. You mentioned John Dewey as the sort of father of our educational principles and sort of values-based education. And he wrote an essay in 1939, right before World War II broke out. And he was writing a speech. It's only 2 pages. But he coins this term called creative democracy, where he says that the reason why we have gotten into trouble in the first place is we understand principles as monolithic rather than as created together and co-designed. And the fact that we've created, and he talks about democracy as something outside over beyond ourselves, our institutions, our role as catalysts and change agents, is why we've gotten into this problem. So he counters, the antidote for him is creative democracy, that we cannot do anything alone, that we must do it together and continuously, that there is no end, there is no final point, there is always moving towards something together. And I think that you've captured that beautifully in your conversations about building a winning culture, about coaching up, about modeling things for your students, about amplifying others, and about the legacy that you've created, which is, it is a constant effort towards excellence that is collaborative rather than competitive as a solo sport. And it's been such a privilege to connect with you and learn from you and see all of the different kind of clusters of coaching philosophy and the All Blacks and pulling those all things together and into this conversation. I've learned so much today, and I really, really am grateful to you.
Thank you, Jess. Actually, I'm just going to turn around for a second because actually there's another impact on me too. So I'm just going to turn around. Hopefully you can see this too. Oh. Can you see what's on the back of my t-shirt?
The all checks.
All checks. So what Pat will know is that I'm married to a Czech lady. So I think, you know, you just talked about that, you know, democracy and culture and that sort of thing. And I think that's understanding of different cultures, etc. And probably one of the biggest influence, obviously, for me has been my wife, but also the Czech culture as well. And your comment highlighted how, again, we often don't understand. So, as growing up, I'm English. I was brought up in the UK. So the East was bad, and the West was good. And of course, growing up in the East, in communist Czech, the West was bad. But of course, that's not the conversation. That's not the truth. Actually, there's lots of good in both. And I think, again, it's that, and you highlighted with that, Pat, with the colleague that sort of goes AWOL, and at the moment with these challenging wars that's happening in Ukraine, it's awful. But again, it's that total lack of understanding that actually we're probably not that too far away from actually thinking the same. But we're going to drop bombs on each other, which is dumb. It's totally stupid. But actually, let's just have a conversation and work this out, because it can't be that hard. And I think that understanding, and it comes back to me, with my, going back to my maths kids, they don't like maths. So I could have hammered away saying maths is fun, and they could have hammered back going, maths is not fun, I'm not enjoying this. So no engagement. So, that has been critical for me in terms of that engagement going forward. And, whatever class as an educator you have, you're looking for the light to go on, my conversation with my student yesterday who'd failed their first assignment, looked like they're failing the second assignment, but I'm pretty sure the light's gone on, and I'm, hopeful at the end that he'll be at least a B or an A student. And I've got lots of examples of that where students have failed early on with me because I've set those expectations high, and they've gone, wow, I failed, but I've managed to get the light go on. Now, it doesn't always happen, but if you can get the light to go on, and actually one of my favorite students came back. He failed his learning contract, but he always comes back to me, and he often talks to my classes and said, I'm Andy's best student, but I failed my learning contract. I failed my first assignment, but I'm Andy's best student. It's real. I think that's the key. It's that engagement. And when we fail communication, whether that's in a relationship or with a student or with your bosses, it's 9 times out of 10 out of lack of engagement, lack of communication. And I think, the challenges we have at the moment with phones and being online and death by Zoom and all those things are just, those are the challenges that we have at the moment. I have to do classes on Zoom too. So how do I engage with my students on Zoom? Yeah. That's been a challenge for me over the last 2 years, but I guess that's what keeps me going as an educator. Every year is different. Every student is different. If I was just teaching the same math subject for 25 years, well, it probably doesn't, do my light bulbs either. But hey, this year's I've got a new class. This is exciting. It might be the 28th year I've had the same class or the same topic, but hey, it's a new class, and they give me the energy that I'm going to have throughout this year, and their growth in the next 6 months is what excites me. I always say that, Outward Bound's a 3-week course, sometimes now a bit shorter. University is just a 3-year course, but it's the personal growth that you get at the end of it. And, you see these young kids grow to being amazing people. So I guess that's what keeps me going as an educator, even though I've been doing it for a long time, and hopefully I've got a little bit more to go.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Andy. I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you today. Really, really great conversation. Thanks so much.
No, my pleasure, and great to have a conversation with two people who are also so enthusiastic about, being good educators, and I'm sure you guys are too. And hopefully there's a couple of nuggets there that you can take going forward. And I've written a couple of books down that I need to start to go and or videos I need to have a go and look at. So I'll certainly do that.
That's awesome.